Bodie, California stands today as one of the best preserved ghost towns of the American West. 110 buildings have been maintained by the California State Parks Department in a state of arrested decay. Repairs are only made to keep the town looking as it did when it was abandoned. In 1880, approximately 8,000 people lived in this gold mining town, the population declining to 1,500 residents in 1886. In 1942, mining operations were suspended, and everyone who once called Bodie home moved away. It's not surprising that over the years, many ghost stories have surrounded Bodie. Out of the thousands of visitors who travel there each year, some claim to have witnessed supernatural apparitions, the smell of food cooking, and sounds of parties from the 19th century. But what may be surprising is that ghosts have been a part of Bodie's history, even in its heyday in 1882. Our first story comes from the Bodie Free Press newspaper, but was shared with the Sacramento Bee. The Sacramento Bee published the article on March 2, 1882. Spooks in Bodie, a mystery which is now agitating the good people of Bodie. Bodie Free Press. Many thought that the article, which appeared in the Free Press Saturday morning, was a canard. But if it was a canard, some very intelligent gentlemen were sadly deceived by it. At the usual hour in the morning, Fraser and McAfee repaired to the spot where they have located their apparition claim, this time accompanied by a couple of friends and a Free Press reporter. And by the way, McAfee, whom our reporter did not see personally, is James A. McAfee, for many years a miner on the Base Range, where he is well and favorably known. Edward P. Fraser was a longtime resident on the Comstock, worked in the Ophir, and is well known in Bodie, although so far, we believe, he has done no work in this camp. What was most remarkable on the occasion of this last watch was the fact that the apparition would only appear at intervals, and then when the party assumed a certain position in the street. Adjacent to the stable, on the property of P. Reddy, lie two large open lots. With the exception of Fraser, the entire party retired to the center of these lots. Fraser stationing himself just around the corner of the stable. In a few minutes, a figure appeared, this time moving. This was the first time it had been seen to move. Fraser called, and the party replied that they could see it distinctly. Everyone was breathless. The figure moved slowly, as if slowly gliding along the side of the stable. Gradually, it assumed the appearance of a large and well-developed dog. The reporter, now having for the first time seen the apparition, could not be expected to have his reportorial wits about him, and accommodations for taking notes were not of the best. About the only way to describe this dog, so that the reader will get a correct idea of his appearance, is to say that it is almost a twin picture of the big black dog that goes around with George's wood dray. But there was the animal, the figure, the apparition, or whatever it might be, distinctly outlined against the walls of the stable. There was no disguising this fact, and there could be no deception in the matter. Of course, conversation was carried on in a low tone, but the voices of the party seemed in no way to disturb the figure. Suddenly, it became absolutely stationary. The party then resolved to move on it in a body. Fraser was all the time not 6 feet from it. All approached within grappling distance, and a simultaneous dive was made for the dog. Never did wizard more amazingly deceive the eyes of an audience. A large dog was as plainly before the eyes of that party as a dog was ever seen in broad daylight. So perfect was the illusion that one of the party, before the effort was made to catch the animal, went so far as to call it in terms of endearment, such as "poor doggy," "good fellow," etc. But the dog was gone from the midst of, and while surrounded by 5 men. Still more marvelous. Recovering somewhat from the surprise which the incident of the dog's apparition and disappearance created, the party sauntered back to the center of the vacant lots, and were discussing the marvel and suggesting to each other the proper course to pursue in order to unravel the wonderful mystery, for it now had become wonderful. Various suggestions were made, and as immediately discarded, when Fraser very suddenly said, "There's what we are looking for." And sure enough, there There alongside the wall was a human figure, to all appearance clothed in a single loose robe of black, which fell in heavy folds from the shoulders. It seemed to be standing on nothing, although the feet were fully 20 inches from the ground. While the face appeared to be turned toward the party, the right arm was clearly outlined against the wall of the building, with the hand closed and the index finger pointing so far as could be observed toward the west, not upwardly, but horizontally. This position was so clear and plain that the entire party could not fail to remark it. This investigating committee were now perfectly cool and collected to a man. It would be a remarkable trick that could deceive them. The stars were bright, and the large space of the two lots was covered with snow as white as a sheet. If there was any trick, they were prepared to expose it at once. The figure was motionless as the party approached. It was as immovable as stone. No breeze disturbed its drapery. With measured tread, the party approached within 2 feet of it. Fraser gave the word, "Now!" A simultaneous grasp was made by 10 determined arms, and the figure was gone. The party were astounded. The figure was so perfectly natural that most of the gentlemen felt like speaking to it. What could be the illusion? If it was only one man, or even 2 men, it might be ascribed to an optical illusion. But where 5 pairs of eyes saw the same thing, and from the same point of view, and experienced the same or a similarity of feeling when they did see it, how are you going to account for it? Pretty much the same result was had as on the 2 former mornings. The apparition would appear, an attempt would be made to capture it. It would as suddenly disappear. Now, how are you going to account for it? No one is prepared to accept it as a supernatural apparition, and yet there is much of the supernatural attached to it. The gentlemen named propose to investigate until they clear up the mystery. In the meantime, parties desiring to investigate this wonder can do so for themselves by repairing to the designated spot between the hours of 2 and 5 o'clock in the morning. Not long after the publication of this article, the Morning Press newspaper in Santa Barbara wrote, "There is a ghost in Bodie, so the papers say." Perhaps our Coluda, disgusted with Santa Barbara, and an inappreciative people, has wandered up there for a change. In Spanish, Coluda means long or big-tailed, and can refer to a demon, but is also a conjugation of coludir, which means to conspire. I could find no ghost stories in Santa Barbara in 1882 that refer to Coluda. However, in 1896, a Santa Barbara newspaper titled a ghost story, "That Coluda Again." A little later in March, the Pacific Bee newspaper out of Sacramento published, "Louis Salmon, the well-known Mono Lake rancher, says that he saw the Bodie ghost scudding along the surface of the lake a few days since, and that he caught it, tied a rock to its neck, and sunk it to the bottom to keep company with his pickled Indians." The Louis Salmon mentioned had been around Mono Lake since 1863. He had a reputation for violence and was generally distrusted. He was known to have killed multiple Indians and was especially hated by the local Paiutes. Mono Lake is about 2.5 times as salty as the ocean, which is why the article used the phrase "pickled Indians" in describing any bodies Louis Salmon may have thrown in the lake. In 1889, Louis Salmon was shot and killed by Jake Gilbert, a member of the Paiute tribe who went by the name of Paiute Jack. Was the story of the Bodie ghost being captured and thrown in the lake a tall tale made up by Salmon? Or did he actually kill someone he thought was the ghost? We may never know. The next story comes from the Los Angeles Times, published on November 25th, 1882. Bodie has a ghost. A spectral woman with a large basket in her hand, a white hood on her head, and clothed in white and black, appears at midnight at a certain locality, moves rapidly in a circle for a while, and then vanishes. Some miners and Chinamen have been frightened out of 10 years' growth by the apparition. The next ghost story in Bodie would take place the following year. On March 2nd, 1883, the Sacramento Union published, "Bodie has another ghost in its minds. This time it is a tall figure in white, bearing a light. When a miner advances toward it, the figure recedes, and whether he goes slow or fast, the same distance is maintained between himself and the sprite. When advancing or receding, the light is swung along, as though borne in the hands of a man." What we are left with are at least 3 distinct ghost stories that took place in Bodie from 1882 to 1883. Each description and behavior of the ghost is different from the others. The first takes place in February of 1882, the article being published in March. The apparition appeared in the morning as a dark figure that transformed into the shape of a dog and then disappeared. It then reappeared as a human figure in a black robe, hovering in the air 20 inches from the ground with an outstretched arm and pointing finger, and then disappeared. The next ghost sighting took place sometime before November. This time, it was a woman dressed in white and black with a white hood on her head. The apparition held a large basket, appeared at midnight in certain places, moved around in a circle, and then vanished. The last ghost sighting was reported in March of 1883. The apparition appeared in the mines, was a tall figure, wearing white, and holding a light that swung as it moved. If these ghost sightings were faked, then the people involved were not only very imaginative, but skilled in illusion and quite determined in continuing the hoax. If these stories were completely made up, a number of Bodie residents would have to be in on the joke. Or perhaps it was all a result of overactive imaginations and optical illusions. Darkness was involved in all 3. The first took place during the early morning, before the sun was too high in the sky. The second took place around midnight, and the third took place in the dark tunnels of the mines. But there's one more story that may help explain it. Before any of these ghost stories took place, sometime in January of 1882, there was a case of grave robbing in Bodie. From the Ventura Free Press, Ventura, California, published March 29th, 1882. Bodie Body Snatchers. The Stanislaus wheat grower makes the following extract from a private letter describing the Bodie horror. Bodie, February 7th, 1882. Some weeks since, it was reported that a boy called Black Dan, brother of the boy that works for A.B. Stewart, had taken some parties to a cabin back of W. Irwin's residence, and there showed the remains, or part of the remains, of a woman all cut up. This got in the Free Press. That started a talk, and the night watchman at the Bodie mine said that about 2 weeks before, he had seen some parties throw something down the Ajax shaft near the Goodshaw mine. It had been done at about midnight. The next day, after the paper notice, parties went down in the shaft, and there found parts of a woman's remains. Dr. Deal called a coroner's inquest, and then the trouble began. Black Dan had run away the day the remains were found, but told that he had cleaned the skull for Dr. Jones and was scraping one of her legs for Dr. Blackwood. Dr. Blackwood swore at the inquest he did not know anything about it, who it was or where it came from, and then ran away. Where? No one knows. It was found that Dr. Blackwood, Johnny Scott, and Green, a sewing machine agent, had the cabin rented. About this time, the town was wild with excitement, and grave after grave was opened. At last, Mrs. Turner's grave was opened, and all of her clothes, even her stockings, were found in the grave, but the body was gone. A large silver filling in one of her teeth was all she was identified by. She was cut and hacked in over 50 pieces. Well, Jones was brought before the inquest and swore he knew nothing, but it was proven that he had the skull, and other things pointed to him as one of the robbers, and one morning it was found that he had run away. Next, Scott skipped. Green is here, as there is no one here that can convict him. Every one of them perjured themselves and could have all been convicted. I think others are in it, but it cannot now be proven. It is a lasting disgrace to every one of them. The woman, whose body was dug up and mutilated, was that of Mary E. Turner, who had died on December 8, 1881. Was the desecration of Mary Turner's grave and corpse the reason behind the hauntings? Was her spirit restless after having been taken from her final resting place? Or had this event so disturbed the minds of the people in Bodie that they began to see shadows as spirits? By the time of the last ghost story in 1883, several mining companies in Bodie had petitioned for insolvency. The closure of some of the mines led to a sudden decrease in population. The town of Bodie was beginning to decline. The grave robbing and ghost sightings became another part of the town's varied history, a chapter that many in Bodie would have been happy to forget.